Interstate highways connected the nation, ushering in a new era of high-speed transportation and instant travel. But behind the ribbon-cutting ceremonies and smooth black asphalt laid something sinister. The purposeful destruction of hundreds of thousands of African-American homes, vivisecting and sometimes erasing whole neighborhoods. On June 29, 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed into effect the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, setting off a chain of events whose consequences reached farther than ever imagined. 37 years earlier, Eisenhower had his first encounter with cross-country travel, and it was not glamorous. As a young member of the Army, Eisenhower spent a now unthinkable 62 days traveling in a convoy from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, all while constantly getting stuck in the mud. Later, while in Germany during World War II, he admired the futuristic Autobahn and dreamt of a day the United States could have such a system. Even before that, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was enamored by GM's sprawling Futurama exhibit at the World's Fair, of which freeways were the centerpiece. As he entered the presidency, Eisenhower moved to make his dream reality. Only a few years later, construction began. As the building frenzy spread across the nation, it permeated one place for which Eisenhower never meant: inner cities. There, African Americans lived in vibrant, hard-working communities. Residents of these neighborhoods fondly recall a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else and kids played together in the streets. City officials, however, were unable to see past the area's mystique of blight. Highways, which were 90% funded by the federal government, were the perfect tool. All at once, they could connect downtowns to the growing suburbs and eliminate seemingly subpar neighborhoods. One such neighborhood wiped away by highways was Rondo, which was bisected by I-94 in St. Paul. Originally a haven for immigrants from Europe, African Americans began moving in as the immigrants scaled the ladder of society and moved to more affluent neighborhoods. Small businesses lined the commercial streets while loving families lived in nearby homes. People who lived there recollect how they never knew that others regarded their neighborhood as a place of neglect. That is, until the bulldozers came. I-94 was routed directly through the heart of Rondo, cleaving bonds and eventually leading to the neighborhood's collapse. This could have been averted, though. Representatives from Rondo pushed for a more northerly route along a railroad right-of-way, which would have resulted in minimal home destruction. Unfortunately, this was quickly rejected. Construction soon commenced, but some residents stayed until the last moments. One former resident of Rondo describes how as a child, they were knocking holes in the walls of my grandfather's house, breaking the windows, tearing up the plumbing, just to make sure he didn't try to move back in there. Countless other neighborhoods, like Black Bottom in Detroit, were wiped off the face of Earth, never to be seen again. Others, like Tremont, New Orleans, and Swansea in Denver, survived but were forever scarred by highways. In Birmingham, Alabama, highways were even used to reinforce the racist 1926 zoning plan. But was the destruction of these neighborhoods purposeful? Here's Patricia Cavanaugh, who researched community opposition to highways for her PhD dissertation.
The language that was used was slum clearance, and different kinds of people lived in slums. Some of those people were African American, some of them were immigrants. So to the extent that slums are synonymous with people who might be considered undesirable, I think that you can decide how you want to interpret that. They were, even as early as the 1930s, writing about the development of the highways, the interstate system, was intended from the very beginning to be through urban areas to relieve congestion and to complement slum clearance.
Soon, highway construction became the preferred method of urban renewal and slum removal, which had been codified into law a few years earlier with the Housing Act of 1949 and later the Housing Act of 1954. Though it might seem like residents could simply both move and move on, the reality is much more complicated, and consequences span a wide spectrum of issues. Directly after the highway construction, evicted families were forced onto the housing market. Unfortunately, it too was racist. As suburbs experienced unprecedented growth, white families moved out of the city and into the suburbs in droves, a phenomenon known as white flight, while bringing their wealth with them. But why did they do this?
Home purchasing after the war, building of the suburbs was heavily subsidized, and so you could buy a lot of house for very little money if you qualified.
That's Katie Caskey, who works in policy planning at the Minnesota Department of Transportation. Another big part of suburbanization was pitching it to the middle class.
That whole 1950s era of living, it was very much advertised as like, this is what you're going for, this is the American dream.
Displaced African Americans had no need to apply, though. Many homes in the suburbs were tied to racially restrictive covenants, which prohibited African Americans from buying specific homes. Instead, they were left in concentrated urban areas of poverty once again, the very areas that highway construction sought to eliminate. Today, these poor neighborhoods lining the highway are plagued by something deeper than financial woes: health issues. Highways, because of the cars using them, undoubtedly increase pollution in nearby areas. Due to this, asthma and other respiratory problems are diagnosed at significantly higher rates in people living near a highway. Here's Kristin Raab, who's a supervisor at the Environmental Impact Analysis Unit at the Minnesota Department of Health.
It can aggravate if you have some kinds of heart diseases and issues, or other respiratory diseases like emphysema, or if you have high blood pressure, things like that. So it doesn't just affect your lungs, it also can affect your heart and other conditions that you might have.
Children are most vulnerable, and health problems like these can significantly detriment their future. In Los Angeles, residents of high-rises situated on highways describe a layer of grime and soot on their balconies, and sometimes even inside their apartment. Health issues like these decrease the ability to rise out of poverty.
And they need to take more time off work for doctor visits, and that may or may not be something you can do at your workplace.
You may not get paid for taking time off. There are a lot of jobs where if you're not working, you don't get paid.
That's Micaela Resh, who works alongside Kristin Raab at the Department of Health in health education. Highways also negatively affect neighborhoods in other ways, including transportation mobility. While it might seem that having a lightning-fast superhighway in your backyard would make it incredibly easy to go anywhere, the opposite is true. Many residents near highways are too poor to own a car, rendering it useless. Not only does it serve no function to them, it also makes universal forms of transport like walking more stressful, unsafe, and overall harder. Education is also negatively impacted. Statistically, children from the richest school districts in the United States are 4 grade levels ahead of those in the poorest. Even in students coming from similar socioeconomic backgrounds, white students were ahead of those who were non-white. Education plays an unparalleled role in escaping poverty, and children in these poorer, predominantly African American areas end up with an education inferior to their richer counterparts.
Education systems are almost, like schools are almost entirely funded by property taxes. And so if you think about property values in any given area, and if the whole white flight concept reduced property values in center city, predominantly people of color neighborhoods, and so I think that has an impact on how much funding those schools get versus if all the money moves out to the suburbs because of the highways.
Though many of these problems are far-flung and intricate, they're not impossible to fix. Already, strides towards equality and sustainability have been made. Boston's Big Dig project buried a notoriously unsightly highway that sliced through the heart of the city, replacing it with a linear park at street level. The Park East Freeway in Milwaukee was torn down, spurring community-focused development. Finally, the Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco was torn down after an earthquake caused damage. It was replaced by an urban boulevard and successfully reconnected the city to its waterfront. In addition, across the country, public transportation is experiencing a renaissance. More and more people are rethinking cities with a focus on people themselves. Interstate highways were a major staple of the imagined future in the 1950s, and officials would stop at nothing to bring them out of fantasies and into the real world. In addition, highways were even specifically built to further the government's slum clearance efforts. Because of this, they ruthlessly destroyed hundreds of neighborhoods, usually African American. Almost always, the residents had little to no say in the process. As a consequence, a conflictual scission between the government and involved parties grew, some of which still lingers. Today, the effects of this top-down planning are starting to show. Nearby residents' health is undeniably harmed by pollution, which can hinder their efforts to hold a job, causing them to earn less and lowering the economic vitality of the neighborhood. With less money to spend on their house, and alongside the fallout from white flight, property values decrease, as do property taxes, causing the education quality to decline. In this way, the vicious cycle of poverty sends the neighborhood spiraling into submission. The compromise for this issue is still partially pending, but many agencies now employ a diversified approach to major construction projects. Steps are being made towards positive progress, though, and someday, through inclusive, educated planning, we might be able to mend the gaps in our neighborhoods caused by highways.